The hammering woke Garrett. Ashford at dawn, 3 strikes. Pause. 2 strikes. Quench. He lay there in the bed above the forge, his heart doing something it hadn't done in 5 years.
Steady
It was
now, the
racing,
magic is
that
volatile.
rhythm, Elena's
I am ready.
rhythm.
Strike!
The one she'd used
Again!
when she thought he was
It
still
holds!
sleeping, back when mornings meant
looks
something
better.
other than another
Thanks to
day to
you.
survive.
You are my
Except
strength.
Elena had been dead since the outbreak took her in 2019. And the dead didn't typically break into forges to meet deadlines. The smell hit him next. Wood smoke, yes, but something else. Something cooking. Soup, maybe. The scent of wild onions and smoked meat drifting up through the floorboards like a ghost from a life he'd buried. Garrett grabbed the fire poker from beside the bed and descended the stairs barefoot. His workshop in Ironwood Creek, Montana had seen exactly 1 visitor in the last month. Mrs. Williams picking up her garden shears. Nobody cooked in his forge. Nobody worked his anvil. Nobody had touched his tools since the day he'd stopped touching the world. What he found at the bottom of the stairs stopped him cold. An orc woman, tall, maybe 6'2", green-skinned, slumped against his workbench like a puppet with cut strings. Her armor hung loose on her frame. Too loose. Her breathing came shallow and quick. And on the table beside her, arranged in neat rows, sat 3 weeks of backlogged orders, all finished, all perfect. She'd been waiting, working, and now she was collapsing. Garrett dropped the poker. It clattered on the stone floor. She didn't even flinch. He crossed the distance in 4 strides, caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed nothing. An orc warrior should be heavy solid. This woman felt like she was made of bird bones and will. "When did you last eat?" The words came out rougher than he'd intended. Her eyes opened, green like new spring leaves, focused on him with an intensity that should have made him step back. Didn't. 3 days. Her voice was gravel and smoke. Mission ran long, needed food. Saw your fire was already lit. She gestured weakly toward his forge. The coals glowed orange in the pre-dawn dark. He'd banked them last night like he did every night, like he'd done every night for 5 years, keeping the routine because routine was the only thing standing between him and the kind of emptiness that swallowed people whole. "Can pay," she said. "Finished your work. Fair trade." Garrett looked at the completed orders again, a set of hinges he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks, the decorative gate piece the mayor had commissioned. 3 kitchen knives he'd started and abandoned because the steel hadn't felt right, except now they sat there gleaming, and from what he could see in the dim light, they were flawless. Near the forge, a pot hung over the coals. The soup. She'd made soup while waiting for him to wake up, while working his backlog, while starving. Dr. Fletcher would say he should take her to the clinic, but the clinic meant questions, and questions meant people caring. And Garrett had spent 5 years making sure nobody cared enough to ask. "Come on," he said. He half carried her to the stool by the workbench. She didn't protest. That alone told him how bad off she was. Warriors didn't accept help easily. He'd learned that from the few orc traders who passed through town. Proud people. Strong people. This woman looked like she'd forgotten what strength felt like. Garrett ladled soup into a wooden bowl. His hands moved on autopilot. The motions belonged to someone else, someone who used to care about things like whether strangers ate or starved, except his hands were shaking. He set the bowl in front of her. Steam rose in lazy spirals. She stared at it like it might disappear if she blinked. "You cooked in my forge," he said. "You're feeding me anyway." She lifted the bowl with both hands and drank. Not sipped. Drank like a woman who'd forgotten what food tasted like. Garrett watched her throat work, watched color start to come back into her face, watched her shoulders lose some of their sharp angles. When she finished, she set the bowl down carefully. Precisely, like returning a weapon to its stand. "Thank you." 2 words. That was all. But they hit him somewhere in the chest in a place that had been closed off so long, he'd forgotten it existed. Elena's voice whispered in his memory, the last thing she'd said before the fever took her. "Don't stop living, Garrett. Promise me you won't stop living." He'd promised, then spent 5 years calling existence living. "You're sick," he said, not a question. The orc woman pulled back her sleeve. Her forearm glowed, not metaphorically. Actual light traced through her veins like cracks in pottery orange and gold, and wrong. The glow pulsed with her heartbeat. "Ember curse," she said. "Fire wound. Burns from the inside. Slow, steady. Nothing stops it." "How long?" "Months. Maybe less. She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Matter of fact, no room for pity. Wanted to die somewhere quiet. Heard about a blacksmith in Montana who understood loss. Garrett's jaw tightened. Who told you that? Does it matter? She pulled her sleeve back down. I came to your town to fade away without anyone asking questions. Found your forge. Saw the work piling up. Figured I'd make myself useful while I waited. For what? For you to wake up. For the curse to finish, whichever came first. She stood. Too fast. Swayed. Garrett caught her elbow. You're not going anywhere, he said. Not like this. I've imposed enough. You finished 3 weeks of what I'd been avoiding. You made soup. You're dying. He heard his voice getting louder. Felt something cracking open in his chest. Least I can do is let you sleep somewhere that isn't the street. She studied his face, looking for something. He didn't know what. One night, she finally said. One night. He set her up in the corner of the workshop on a pile of old blankets he usually used to wrap finished pieces. She didn't complain, didn't ask for better, just laid down and closed her eyes like someone who'd learned to sleep anywhere. Garrett stood there for a long moment, looking at her. This dying orc warrior who'd broken into his forge and somehow made it feel less empty. Then he did what he always did when feelings got too complicated. He turned to the fire and started working. He was reheating an axe head when her voice drifted across the workshop. You count your strikes. His hammer paused mid-swing. What? 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes. It's a rhythm? Consistent, Mazen. My wife's rhythm. The words came out before he could stop them. Silence. Then she taught you well. Garrett brought the hammer down. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes. The metal sang under his hands, the same song it had sung for 20 years. The same song Elena had taught him when they were young and stupid and thought they had all the time in the world. Keep it, the orc woman said softly. It's a good rhythm. For the first time since Elena died, Garrett worked through the night without talking to her portrait. The painting hung above his workspace like it always did. Elena smiling down at him forever caught mid-laugh at something he could no longer remember. But tonight he didn't tell the portrait about his day. Didn't fill the silence with one-sided conversations. Because for the first time in 5 years, the silence wasn't quite so silent. Morning came cold and clear. Garrett woke to find the orc woman already at the anvil working a piece of steel with movements so precise they looked like a dance. What are you doing? He descended the stairs, still half asleep. Repaying the debt. You fed me, gave me shelter. She didn't look up from her work. I work. You should be resting. Rest is for people who have time to waste. She brought the hammer down. 7 strikes this time. Fast controlled each one exactly where it needed to be. Then into the forge, then out. Then 7 more strikes. Garrett watched her fold the steel. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. 7-fold steel, she said, answering his unasked question. Northern technique, stronger than 3-fold. Takes longer. Requires patience. I know 3-fold. I'll teach you 7. She did. For the next hour, her hands guided his, showing him where to strike, how hard when to fold. Her hands were rough, calloused, scarred, hands that had held weapons longer than they'd held anything else. But they were gentle on his, patient. Like this, Garrett asked, bringing the hammer down. Exactly. Feel the metal. It tells you when it's ready. By the time they finished, the sun had fully risen. The steel gleamed on the workbench between them. Perfect 7-fold. Better than anything he'd made in years. Why help me? Garrett set the hammer down. You're dying. Why spend your time teaching a stranger? She met his eyes, held his gaze. Because I'm dying. Want to matter before I'm gone. The words hit him like a hammer to the chest. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. She smiled. Not a big smile. Just a small quirk of her lips. Like she understood exactly what he couldn't say. I'm Thyra, she said. Thyra Stonefang. And you are Garrett Ashford. Good to meet you, Garrett Ashford. She extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was firm, strong, the grip of someone who hadn't given up yet. That became their rhythm. Thyra would work in the mornings. Garrett would watch her learn, gradually join in. She'd show him techniques he'd never seen. He'd show her tricks Elena had taught him. They'd hammer metal into submission together, and for hours at a time, Garrett would forget that one of them was dying and the other had been dead for 5 years. By the end of the first week, Thyra was sleeping in the loft above the workshop instead of on the floor. Garrett told himself it was practical, warmer up there, more comfortable, not because he'd started listening for her breathing at night to make sure she was still alive. By the end of the second week, she'd made him a gift. He found it on the workbench one morning. A tool belt, hand-stitched leather sized perfectly for his frame, with loops and pockets for every tool he used regularly. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each stitch precise, each fold deliberate. "You keep dropping things," Thyra said from behind him. "Thought you could use it." Garrett picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was beautiful, practical, personal. "Thank you," he said. He set it carefully on the shelf near the forge, where he kept things that were too nice to risk damaging, where he kept the letter Elena had written him before she died, where he kept her wedding ring. Thyra watched him do this. Her face didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, gone too fast to name. The third week brought a small clay jar, sealed with wax. "Salve," she said, "for burns, northern herbs, works better than anything you'll find in town." Garrett opened it and smelled mountain pine and something sharp he couldn't identify. It probably did work better, probably cost her effort she couldn't spare to make. "It's perfect," he said. He placed it on the shelf next to the tool belt. Didn't miss the way her jaw tightened. Just for a second, just enough to notice. Week 4 brought something different, something that made Garrett stop and actually look. A carved wooden charm on a leather cord. Thyra set it on his workbench without ceremony, without explanation. Just placed it there and stepped back. Garrett picked it up. The charm was intricate, orcish knotwork that must have taken hours to carve. Days, maybe. Each line deliberate, each curve precise, each symbol meaningful in ways he didn't understand. The wood was dark, smooth, worn in places like she'd carried it herself before giving it to him. Protection symbols, probably. Old traditions, the kind passed down through generations, the kind you didn't give to strangers. "What is this?" he asked. "Protection," she said. Her voice was soft, careful. "Old orc tradition, for people who matter, for people who matter." The words hung in the air between them. Garrett turned the charm over in his hands, felt the weight of it, the hours of work, the significance of giving someone a protection charm when you yourself were dying and had no protection left. "It's beautiful," he said. He placed it on the shelf next to the belt in the salve. Watched her watch him do it, saw something in her expression shift, something that might have been disappointment or might have been resignation. But he didn't know what else to do with beautiful things except preserve them, keep them safe, keep them from being damaged by use. Elena's ring sat on that same shelf, untouched for 5 years. Week 5 arrived with autumn's first real cold snap. Garrett was working late when Thyra walked in carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. She set it on his workbench with more force than strictly necessary. "What's this? Food, bread, cheese, smoked venison." "I have food. You work through meals." "I'm fine. You're thin. I'm efficient. You're malnourished and I'm managing my time well." She crossed her arms, stood there like a wall, like someone who'd decided this was a hill worth dying on and had no intention of retreating. Garrett opened his mouth to argue, caught the look on her face. The absolute certainty that she was right and he was being an idiot. And laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite chuckle he sometimes forced for customers, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest and surprised him with how rusty it sounded. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Months, probably years. Thyra's entire expression changed, softened in a way that made her look suddenly unexpectedly vulnerable. Like she'd just witnessed something she'd been hoping to see for a very long time. She didn't say anything, just watched him with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable, but instead made something warm unfold in the space below his ribs. Garrett ate the food, all of it, right there while she watched. It was the first meal he'd actually tasted in weeks instead of just mechanically consuming for fuel. When she left that evening, he caught himself wishing she'd stayed longer. Dangerous thought, the kind that led to expecting things, to wanting things, to the possibility of losing things. That night, he arranged the gifts neatly on their shelf. The tool belt, the salve, The charm with its intricate carvings, the empty cloth from the food. She keeps bringing me things, he told Elena's portrait. I think it's an orc custom. Hospitality, maybe. The painted face smiled its eternal smile. She's just being kind, he added, as if the portrait had suggested otherwise. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He touched the charm briefly, felt the smooth wood, the hours of work it represented, the protection offered when she had none left for herself, then pulled his hand back and went to bed. The fifth week started like all the others, Thyra working, Garrett watching, both of them falling into a rhythm that felt older than the few weeks they'd known each other. Except this time Thyra couldn't lift the hammer. Garrett saw her try, saw her face set with determination, saw her hands shake as they gripped the handle. The weight that had once been nothing to her might as well have been a mountain. She set it down, carefully, precisely. Her breathing had gone rough. The curse is faster now, she said. Not an apology, just a statement of fact. Garrett crossed the distance between them, stood behind her, wrapped his hands over hers on the hammer handle. Together then, he guided her hands, lifted with her, brought the hammer down together. 3 strikes, pause. 2 strikes, the metal sang. Thyra smiled, not her small smile, a real one that changed her entire face. They worked like that for an hour, his hands over hers, moving together. And Garrett realized with something like shock that this felt right, more right than anything had felt in 5 years. When they finished, Thyra turned in the circle of his arms. For one breathless moment, they stood too close, close enough that he could see the exact green of her eyes, close enough that he could feel the too-hot fever heat of the curse burning through her. Garrett, she started. The workshop door slammed open. 3 orc warriors in patrol armor stood in the doorway. The lead one, a male with scars crossing his face, looked directly at Thyra. Commander Thyra. We've been searching for you. Garrett felt Thyra stiffen, felt her pull away from him like she'd been burned. I told you I wasn't coming back, she said. Her voice had gone cold. Military, nothing like the woman who'd laughed with him over breakfast. The clans need their war chief. The clans have managed without me. War chief. The words hung in the air like smoke. The scarred orc's eyes flicked to Garrett, back to Thyra. At least let us know you're alive. They think you deserted. Tell them whatever you want. Tell them I died. Tell them I found something worth staying for. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just for a second. Just tell them to leave me alone. The patrol exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they'd have this conversation again. As you command, War Chief. They left. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. Garrett stood there, processing. War Chief, Commander. Not just a dying warrior, someone important. Someone with responsibilities. Someone who'd walked away from everything to die in his forge. Garrett, Thyra started again. Who are you? The question came out quieter than he'd intended. Really, she looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something in her eyes that looked like fear. I'm Thyra, that's all I want to be, just Thyra. But you're not, are you? She turned away, walked to the window, looked out at the Montana mountains turning gold in the afternoon light. I was war chief of the Northern Orc clans, led them for 8 years, made peace with 3 human kingdoms, fought in battles I'll never forget. Her voice was soft, distant. Then I got the curse, realized I'd spent my whole life being a commander, being a symbol, never just being. So you came here. So I came here, to die as just Thyra, not the war chief, not the symbol. Just a woman who wanted to matter to someone as herself before she was gone. Garrett felt something shift in his chest, understanding, recognition, the same thing he'd been doing for 5 years, hiding, building walls. Except his walls were made of grief and hers were made of distance from who she used to be. The patrol, he said, they were from your old unit. Yes. And you sent them away. Yes. Why? She turned back to face him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with something fiercer. Because I found something here worth staying for. The words hung between them, heavy, full of meaning neither of them was ready to touch. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. Elena's portrait seemed to watch him from across the room. Don't stop living, her memory whispered. You should rest, he finally said. Curse is taking more out of you. Thyra nodded, didn't argue. That alone told him how weak she was getting. She climbed the stairs to the loft. Garrett watched her go, watched her shoulders, her back, the way she moved like every step cost her something. Then he turned to Elena's portrait. She's not who I thought she was, he said to the painting. She's someone important, someone with a whole life I know nothing about. The portrait smiled its eternal smile. She lied to me, sort of, didn't tell me everything. Still smiling. But she came here to die alone, chose to spend her last time here. With me, working metal, making gifts I put on shelves instead of using. Garrett looked at the shelf, the tool belt, the salve, the charm with its protective symbols, all the things she'd given him, all the things he'd preserved instead of used. For the first time, he really looked at them, not as things to be preserved, but as what they were. Messages, reaching out, trying to connect with someone who'd spent 5 years refusing to be reached. I'm an idiot, he told the portrait. Elena's smile seemed to say yes. But you're learning. Garrett took down the tool belt, put it on. The leather fit perfectly, like it had been made just for him. Because it had. Tomorrow he'd use the salve. Tomorrow he'd wear the charm. Tomorrow he'd start actually receiving the gifts instead of just acknowledging them. But tonight he stood in his workshop with a tool belt on and a dying orc warrior sleeping in his loft and Elena's portrait smiling down at him. And for the first time in 5 years, Garrett Ashford felt something that might have been hope. Dangerous feeling, the kind that could get him hurt again. But as he banked the forge for the night, as he listened to Thyra breathing in the darkness above, as he touched the leather of the belt one more time, Garrett thought maybe hurt was worth it. Maybe Elena had been right. Maybe it was time to stop existing and start living. The portrait question came on a Tuesday morning, 14 days after the patrol had left. 14 days of Thyra working beside him in silence that felt heavier than before. They were standing near the forge, Garrett explaining something about grain structure in steel that she probably already knew but listened to anyway. Her gaze drifted upward, stopped on Elena's portrait hanging above the workspace. Frozen forever mid-laugh, dark hair catching light that no longer existed, the smile that had once meant everything. Who is she? Thyra's voice was careful, the kind of careful that meant that she already knew the answer would matter. Garrett's hand stopped moving. Everything stopped moving. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the forge, and he realized he'd been waiting for someone to ask this for 5 years, also desperately hoping no one ever would. My wife. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw from a throat that had spoken them too many times to paintings and not enough to people. Where is she now? No dancing around it, no careful euphemisms, just the question, clean and sharp as a blade. Dead, 5 years, the outbreak in 2019. Thyra nodded once, taking this in. Garrett waited for the usual responses, the apologies that meant nothing. The assurances that time healed all wounds, which was a lie time itself seemed determined to disprove. The awkward retreat from a topic that made everyone uncomfortable. Instead, she asked, do you think she'd want you to stop living? The question detonated something in Garrett's chest. He felt heat rise up his neck, felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached, felt 5 years of carefully maintained control crack like bad steel under stress. You don't know anything about her. His voice came out sharp enough to cut. You don't get to stand in my forge and tell me what she'd want. You're right. Thyra's voice stayed level, maddeningly calm in the face of his anger. I don't know her, I never will. But I know what dying looks like, and I know the difference between honoring the dead and joining them. Get out. The dead don't need your loyalty, Garrett. She used his name with purpose, with weight. They're dead. They're past needing anything. They need you to live, to actually live, not just go through the motions of not being buried yet. I said, get out. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was almost pitying, which somehow made it worse, made the anger burn hotter, made him want to throw something or break something or do anything except feel the truth of her words settling into his bones. Then she picked up the small pack she'd brought with her weeks ago, the one she'd never unpacked. The one that suggested she'd always known this was temporary. She walked toward the door, paused at the threshold. Backlit by Montana afternoon sun turning everything gold. She loved you. That's obvious from how you look at her. her, which means she'd be furious at what you've done to yourself. Then she was gone. Garrett stood there shaking, his hands curled into fists, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not the cold, distant sadness that had become his constant companion. Not the numb going through motions emptiness. This was hot, alive, actual anger that burned in his veins and made his heart pound and reminded him that hearts were supposed to do more than just mechanically pump blood through a body that had forgotten why it was bothering. That night, he didn't speak calmly to the portrait. He yelled at it. "She's wrong, right? You'd want me to remember you. You'd want me to keep everything exactly how it was. You'd want—" He trailed off, breathing hard. And in the silence that followed, he heard it. Not out loud, not really, but somewhere in the part of his mind that still held Elena's voice, still remembered how she sounded when she was exasperated with him. He heard her say with absolute clarity, "You absolute idiot." Garrett sank onto the stool by his workbench, put his head in his hands, and for the first time since the funeral, he cried. Not the silent, controlled tears he'd shed alone in the dark. These were ugly, gasping sobs that shook his whole body, that tore out of him like they'd been waiting 5 years for permission, that left him hollowed out and raw, and somehow inexplicably like he could finally breathe properly for the first time since Elena died. When they finally subsided, the workshop felt different, lighter, like something had been released that had been pressing down on everything for too long. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looked at the portrait. Elena smiled down at him with that same eternal expression. Except now it didn't look like approval of his grief. It looked like she was waiting, patient, ready for him to figure out what she'd been trying to tell him all along. Don't stop living, not don't stop remembering, not don't stop grieving, don't stop living. Garrett stood, walked to the door, opened it. The street outside was empty. Thyra was gone, had been gone for hours. He closed the door, went back to the workbench, tried to work. The steel wouldn't cooperate. Every piece came out wrong, brittle, warped, flawed in ways that spoke of a mind that wasn't present for the process. 3 days passed. Thyra didn't come back. Garrett told himself he was relieved. Also told himself he wasn't watching the door every time he heard footsteps outside. Also told himself a lot of other lies that fell apart the moment he stopped moving long enough to examine them. On the 4th day, he gave up pretending to work. Just sat on the floor of the forge staring at the shelf where her gifts lined up like accusations. The tool belt he'd worn once and then returned to the shelf. The salve he'd never opened. The charm he'd acknowledged and ignored. All the ways she'd reached out. All the ways he'd stood still and called it loyalty to Elena's memory. He stood, legs unsteady, took down the tool belt, the first gift, the one she'd brought weeks ago. Turned it over in his hands and saw for the first time what he'd missed in his careful, deliberate blindness. An engraving on the inside of the leather, small, precise, letters carved with the same precision as the stitching. Not English, something else. Orcish, probably. Garrett grabbed his coat, walked 3 streets over to Henrik's jewelry shop. The old man was the only person in Ironwood Creek who traveled enough to know languages beyond English and bad Spanish. Henrik took one look at the inscription and raised his eyebrows. Orcish. Haven't seen this dialect in years. Northern clans. Where'd you get this? What does it say? Henrik squinted, tilted the leather toward the light streaming through his shop window. For the man who taught me that being seen is worth dying for. He looked up at Garrett with sudden understanding in his weathered face. Someone made this for you. Garrett couldn't speak. The words had taken all the air out of the room, out of his lungs, out of the careful structure he'd built to keep feeling at a manageable distance. He took the belt back, mumbled something that might have been thanks, walked out into the street feeling like the ground had turned to water beneath his feet. She'd spent her dying time teaching him, bringing him gifts, trying to reach him. And every gift had been a message he'd been too buried in the past to read. The salve for burns. She was burning from the inside and she'd made medicine for him, the charm, for protection. She couldn't protect herself, but she tried to protect him. The food, making him taste life again when she was losing hers. And the belt, the first gift, the one that said, "You taught me being seen is worth dying for." Except he hadn't taught her that. She'd taught him, was still trying to teach him. was spending her last precious months trying to pull him out of his grave while he stood there with a shovel and called it remembering. Garrett walked, not toward home, just walked, through Ironwood Creek's small downtown, past the hardware store and the diner and the post office, past people who nodded at him because that's what you did in small towns. Nodded and moved on and didn't ask questions about the blacksmith who'd been a ghost for 5 years. He ended up at the market without meaning to. Saturday, the weekly market where local farmers sold produce and crafts, people sold their work, and the whole town came together to pretend they were a community instead of just people who happened to live near each other. And there she was, Thyra, moving between stalls with the careful deliberation of someone conserving energy they no longer had in abundance, buying supplies, dried meat, bandages, trail rations. The kind of provisions someone took on a long patrol, a dangerous one. The sight of her preparing for another mission when she should have been resting, should have been anywhere but the front lines, should have been here with him, made something snap in Garrett's chest. He caught up to her between the spice merchant and the cloth vendor, grabbed her arm without thinking. "Why didn't you tell me?" She turned. Recognition hit, followed immediately by something that looked like resignation. She yanked her arm free with more force than necessary. "Tell you what, that you're dying." The words came out louder than he'd intended. A few nearby shoppers glanced over with interest. He lowered his voice. "The Ember Curse. Why didn't you tell me the first day?" Thyra laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered. I would have—" "What?" She stepped closer. There was something fierce in her eyes now, something that had been held back until this moment. "What would you have done differently?" "Garrett pitied me, treated me like I was made of glass. You can barely handle talking to me when you think I'm healthy. What the hell would you have done if you'd known I was dying from day one?" He opened his mouth, found he had no answer. Because she was right, and they both knew it. "You've been dead for 5 years," her voice was getting louder now. Months of patience finally breaking. "At least I have an excuse. I'm actually dying. What's yours?" She didn't wait for him to respond. "I thought if I was patient, if I just kept showing up, if I proved myself over and over again, you'd finally choose to live. That maybe seeing someone fight to stay in the world would remind you that being in the world was worth fighting for." The words hit him like hammer blows, each one precise, devastating. "But you don't want to live. You want to hide in that forge and pretend everything ended when she died. Don't talk about her like you understand." "I don't understand." Thyra cut him off, and there was something raw in her voice now, something beyond anger. "I don't know her, I never will, but I know you're wasting a life she would have killed to have more of. I know you're so busy being loyal to a memory that you can't see anything real standing right in front of you." She paused, breathing hard. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something quieter, more devastating. "I've spent months trying to reach you, bringing you things, staying close, waiting for you to ask one single question about me, about why I keep coming back, about anything that wasn't about metal or work or the past you're determined to live in. I didn't know what you wanted. I wanted you to want to know." The simplicity of it, the truth of it, hit him harder than all her anger combined. She stepped back. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving only exhaustion in its wake, the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just the curse. "I'm done, Garrett. I have maybe 3 months left if I'm lucky, probably less, and I'm not spending them trying to convince someone that I'm worth their time, that I'm worth the risk of caring about, that I'm worth looking at as something more than just another person bringing work to your forge." She turned away, started gathering her supplies, and he felt panic rising in his throat because this felt final in a way their previous argument hadn't. "Thyra, wait." "No," she didn't look back. "I waited for months. I waited. Now I'm done waiting." She walked away, moving through the market crowd with the kind of dignity that came from having nothing left to lose. And Garrett stood there frozen, his feet rooted to the ground like they'd forgotten how to move forward. Someone bumped into him, apologized, moved on. The market continued around him, people buying and selling and living their lives, completely unaware that his entire understanding of the last few months had just reorganized itself into something unbearable. She'd been dying. She'd been spending her last precious months trying to save him from himself. And he'd been so buried in his own grief that he'd let her do all the work of reaching while he stood still and called it loyalty to Elena. He didn't follow her. The crowd swallowed her up. And he stood there among the vegetables and fabrics in ordinary commerce, understanding that he'd just lost something irreplaceable, and that this time it was entirely, completely, devastatingly his own fault. Garrett walked home in a daze. The town looked different, sharper, like someone had turned up the contrast on everything. The mountains in the distance seemed closer, the sky seemed bluer, the air tasted like autumn and regret. He stood in front of Elena's portrait for a long time that night, just looking at her frozen smile, her forever laugh, trying to remember what her voice had sounded like when she was disappointed in him. It came back, eventually, sharp and clear. "I love her," he said to the painting. "I'm in love with an orc warrior who's dying, who spent months trying to reach me while I hid behind your memory like a coward." His voice cracked. "I let her walk away. I let her think she wasn't worth fighting for. You'd be so angry at me right now." The portrait said nothing, but in his memory and the part of his mind that still held her voice perfectly preserved, he heard Elena say with absolute exasperated clarity, "You absolute idiot! Go get her!" He stood, put on the bracelet, felt the leather warm against his skin like it had been waiting all this time for him to actually wear it, to actually use it, to actually receive what was being given instead of just acknowledging it existed. He looked around the forge, at the cold hearth, at the tools hung in their precise places, at the routine he'd built to keep himself from having to choose anything beyond survival. Then he walked upstairs, grabbed supplies he'd need for travel, came back down, and left the forge without lighting the fire. The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. For the first time in 5 years, the forge sat cold and empty, and Garrett was somewhere else, moving towards something instead of away from it, choosing risk over safety, choosing the terrifying possibility of more loss over the certainty of never having anything worth losing again. The stable master looked at him like he'd asked to borrow a dragon. "You want a horse?" "Yes." "You, Garrett Ashford, who I've never seen further than 3 streets from his forge in 5 years, want to borrow a horse?" "Yes." Pete, the stable master, was 60 if he was a day, had run the stables since before Garrett moved to Ironwood Creek, had seen things, had opinions about them, was currently forming an opinion about this. "Can you ride? I'll figure it out." Pete sighed the sigh of someone who knew he was watching a disaster unfold but was too tired to stop it. He led Garrett to a gray mare who took one look at him and immediately conveyed through body language alone that she found him personally offensive. "Her name's Ash. She's temperamental, but she's steady on rough terrain." Garrett mounted with all the grace of a sack of potatoes being thrown over a fence. Ash made a sound that suggested she was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. They made it out of town at a pace that could generously be called glacial. Garrett tried not to think about how much time he was losing, how many days Thyra might not have, how the clock had been ticking this entire time, and he'd been too buried in his own past to hear it. The border outpost came up 12 hours later. His entire body screamed from muscles he hadn't known existed. The guard on duty looked him over with barely concealed amusement. "Lost? Looking for someone? Orc commander, female, takes the dangerous patrols." The guard's amusement faded into something more serious. "The one with the death wish, yeah. She came through 4 days ago, headed for Widow's Ridge." "Where's that?" 3 days north, through territory that's been nothing but bandits and worse for the last month." The guard studied him, really looked at him. "You're not military. You're not a fighter. What business do you have at Widow's Ridge?" "I need to find her." "You'll die, probably." The guard stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen this story before. "This is about a woman, isn't it?" "Yes." "Figures." He pulled out a rough map. "Mark the route. Stay on the main road until you see the split oak, then north until the river crossing. After that, you're on your own. Don't die stupidly. Die heroically. Better story." Garrett took the map and rode on into territory that got progressively more hostile with every mile. He saw signs of recent fighting. Burned wagons, abandoned camps. Once a patrol of soldiers who eyed him with suspicion but let him pass when he explained he was looking for the orc commander. Because apparently everyone knew about her. About the warrior taking suicide missions like they were routine assignments. He slept under stars that felt accusatory, lying on ground that was too hard and too cold. And when he finally managed to fall asleep, he dreamed of the forge, of Thyra standing in the firelight, handing him tools before he asked, moving through his space like she belonged there. All the moments he'd missed because he'd been too afraid to look directly at something that might matter, too terrified of the possibility that letting someone in meant eventually watching them leave. On the third day, he was exhausted, starving, reasonably certain Ash had been planning his murder since approximately hour 2 of their acquaintance. His legs ached, his back screamed. Every part of him that could hurt did hurt. Some parts he hadn't known could hurt had decided to join the chorus, but he kept riding, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the possibility that he was too late, that she'd already gone somewhere he couldn't follow. One thought drove him forward, a prayer or a promise or maybe just desperation given words. I see you now. I'm sorry it took me so long. I see you now. Please, please let me not be too late. Widow's Ridge earned its name. Garrett understood that the moment he crested the final ridge and saw what lay below. Bodies scattered across the narrow mountain pass, some in the rough leather of bandits, others in border guard uniforms, all of them very thoroughly dead. Smoke still rose from a supply wagon that had been set ablaze. The air tasted of blood and ash and recent violence, like the earth itself was still processing what had happened here. Garrett dismounted. His legs nearly gave out. He moved through the carnage on foot, checking faces with a growing dread that sat like ice in his chest. Not her, not her, not her, please, not her. Then he saw movement, near a boulder at the pass's narrowest point, a shift of green against gray stone. His heart stopped and restarted in the same breath. Thyra was slumped against the rock, her armor cracked in 3 places, blood staining the leather dark. Her sword planted in the ground beside her like a gravestone marker. Her eyes were closed. Garrett ran, or tried to. His exhausted body managed something between a jog and a controlled fall. His boots slipped on loose stone. He didn't care. Thyra, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening with visible effort. She blinked, twice, like she thought she might be hallucinating. Garrett. She said his name like she was testing whether it was real. What the hell are you doing here? He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her injuries, not knowing where to touch that wouldn't cause pain. Blood soaked through her side. Her breathing came shallow and quick. I came to tell you something. If it's an apology, save it. Too tired to be angry. There was no heat in the words, just bone-deep exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. Like she'd used up everything she had left fighting and had nothing remaining for this conversation. It's not an apology. Garrett took her hand, the one that wasn't pressed against her ribs trying to keep blood inside her body, held it like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. I see you. The words came out rough, raw, scraped from somewhere deep in his chest where he'd been keeping them locked away for months. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I made you do all the work of reaching while I stood still and called it loyalty. But I see you now, Thyra. I see you and I love you. Her breath hitched. Tears started sliding down her face, cutting tracks through the dirt and blood and exhaustion. And Garrett realized he was crying too. Ugly, graceless tears that he'd spent 5 years not allowing himself. I'm dying, Garrett. Her voice broke on his name. The curse is faster now. Weeks, maybe less. I don't have time for this to be something worth having. Then let me love you anyway. He leaned forward, rested his forehead against hers, feeling her warmth. The too-hot fever heat of the curse burning through her like a forge fire turned inward. However long we have, a week, a day, an hour. Let me choose you. Let me be there. Let me matter to you the way you mattered to me before I was brave enough to admit it. She pulled him closer with what strength she had left, kissed him, and it tasted like smoke and salt and blood and desperation and something that might have been hope. When she pulled back, she was smiling through the tears, and Garrett thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful than this dying warrior who decided he was worth her last months of life. Okay, she said, you can love me, but you have to carry me down this mountain because I think I broke 3 ribs and possibly something in my left leg. He laughed, the sound half sob. I can do that. She studied his face, her smile growing slightly. There was something playful in her eyes despite the pain, despite everything. Did that horse bite you? Garrett touched his arm where Ash had gotten him on day 2. Yes. You're such a disaster. I'm your disaster now. Yeah. She reached up, touched his face with her good hand, her expression soft in a way he'd never seen before. You are. So let's go home before I bleed out and make this whole dramatic rescue pointless. He gathered her as carefully as he could. She winced despite his best efforts, made a sound in the back of her throat that told him exactly how much this hurt. But she didn't complain, just wrapped her good arm around his neck and let him carry her. The walk back down the mountain took hours. Ash gave him a look when he approached that clearly said she'd expected better from him, but she stood still while he carefully lifted Thyra onto her back, climbed up behind her, held her against his chest as they started the long ride home. The sun was setting behind them, painting Widow's Ridge golden red. And for the first time since Elena died, Garrett felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from everything. The ride back to Ironwood Creek took 2 days. Dr. Marion Fletcher met them at the edge of town like she'd been expecting them, which she probably had. Small towns had their ways of knowing things. She looked at Thyra's wounds, at the glow of the curse visible through torn fabric, at Garrett's face, and said nothing except bring her to the clinic. They worked through the night, Fletcher cleaning wounds, setting the broken rib, wrapping bandages with practiced efficiency. And through it all, Garrett held Thyra's hand and didn't let go. When Fletcher finally stepped back, she looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss. The injuries will heal, but the curse, I know. Weeks, not months. I know. I'm sorry, Garrett. He nodded, couldn't speak. Fletcher left them alone in the small clinic room with moonlight streaming through the window and the certain knowledge that time was not their friend. Thyra's fingers tightened around his. Take me to the forge. You need rest. I need home. Your forge is home. So he carried her, back through empty streets, back to the workshop that had been his prison for 5 years, back to the place where she'd first appeared and changed everything without asking permission. He settled her in the loft, in the bed he'd given her weeks ago, covered her with blankets, started to pull away. Her hand caught his. Stay. He stayed. That first night she fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, and Garrett lay there in the darkness, listening to her breathe, counting each breath like currency he didn't have enough of. Day 1 dawned cold and clear. Thyra woke before sunrise, stronger than she'd been on the mountain but still weak. The curse glow had spread, visible now even through clothing, like she was burning from the inside out and the light couldn't be contained anymore. Good morning, she said. Good morning. They had breakfast, bread and jam and coffee that tasted better than anything had tasted in years. Not because it was special, because she was there, because he'd chosen this, because every moment felt both infinite and desperately finite. After they worked, she couldn't lift the heavy hammer anymore, but she could guide, could teach, could stand beside him and correct his form and show him the 7-fold steel technique until he got it right. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, their rhythm, their language, the thing that had brought them together. Day 15 found them reading together in the evenings. Garrett teaching her the English words she'd always struggled with, her teaching him orcish phrases that sounded like gravel and thunder. She fell asleep during a chapter about human kingdoms, her breathing evening out into something peaceful. He kept reading anyway, his voice low, because he'd learned by then that she slept better when there wasn't silence, when she wasn't alone with whatever dreams the curse brought. Day 22, she taught him an orc drinking song, about a warrior who got drunk and challenged a bear to single combat. The melody was complicated. The words were mostly threats disguised as poetry. Garrett was terrible at it, couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he tried anyway. And she laughed so hard she had to sit down, had to press her hand against her ribs because laughing hurt, but she couldn't stop. He memorized that laugh, stored it somewhere deep where grief couldn't touch it when the time came. Day 30 brought the first major decline. Thyra reached for the hammer, her hand closed around it, shook so badly the metal vibrated like a struck bell. She set it down with visible frustration. "I can't," she said, and the defeat in her voice broke something in him. Garrett moved behind her, wrapped his hands over hers on the hammer handle. Together then, they lifted, brought the hammer down. 3 strikes. Pause. 2 strikes. The metal sang its ancient song. And Thyra smiled through tears. They worked like that for an hour, his hands over hers, moving together, until she was too tired to stand and he carried her back to the loft. That night, he told her about Elena. Really told her. Not just that she'd died, but who she'd been, what she'd meant, how she'd made him promise not to stop living, and how he'd broken that promise for 5 years. "She'd like you," he said. "Would have liked you. You're both stubborn, both see through nonsense." Thyra smiled in the darkness. "I like her too, from what you've told me. She made you who you are. You're making me who I'm becoming. Good, be that person, even after." Even after. The words hung in the air, a future neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Day 45 arrived with the first frost. Thyra couldn't get out of bed. The curse had moved into her lungs, her legs, burning through her from the inside with increasing speed. Dr. Fletcher came daily, brought medicines that eased pain, but couldn't stop what was coming. So Garrett brought the forge to her. He described the orders he was working on, the customers who came through, the gossip Mrs. Williams had shared about the mayor's new girlfriend. He described the color of metal as it heated, the sound of the quench, the way the shop cat had somehow gotten into the forge and knocked over an entire rack of files. Thyra listened with her eyes closed, squeezed his hand when the pain got bad, and he talked until his voice went hoarse because silence felt like giving up. Day 52, she asked him to read Elena's letter. "The one she wrote before she died. You mentioned it once. I want to hear it." Garrett hesitated. That letter had lived on the shelf for 5 years. Unread after the first time because reading it hurt too much. But he got it, unfolded it with shaking hands. Elena's handwriting, familiar. "Beloved. My love," he read. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're probably sitting in that forge of ours talking to my portrait instead of real people. Stop it. I'm dead, Garrett. You're not. Don't stop living. Promise me. Find someone who makes you laugh. Find someone who sees you. Let them in. Love them, even if it scares you, especially if it scares you. Because being scared means it matters, and things that matter are worth the risk of losing them. I loved you. I love you still, wherever I am, but I need you to live. Really live. That's the only thing you can give me now." His voice broke on the last words. Thyra's hand found his. She was wise. She was. "I'm glad you kept your promise, eventually." "Me too." Day 58, Thyra couldn't speak above a whisper. The curse had taken her voice, had taken almost everything except her eyes. Those still blazed, still saw him, still held everything she couldn't say anymore. Garrett read to her, told her stories, described the world outside the window. The way autumn had turned to early winter. The way snow was starting to dust the Montana mountains. She listened, squeezed his hand, and in those squeezes he heard everything. "I'm here, I'm still here, I see you too." Day 60 dawned cold and clear. Garrett woke before sunrise, felt Thyra stir beside him. She had more strength than she'd had in days, the kind of surge he recognized from Elena's last day. The body's final gift before the end. She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Garrett, I'm here. Thank you." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was there. "For seeing me, for choosing me, for these days." "Don't," his voice broke. "Don't say goodbye yet." She smiled, the same smile she'd given him that first morning in the forge, confident and a little fierce. "Not goodbye, just thank you." She closed her eyes. He felt her hand go slack in his. He sat there holding her as the sun rose, as the forge below stayed cold, as the world continued turning without her in it. And for the second time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose someone who'd made the world make sense. But this time was different. This time he'd chosen to love anyway. This time he had no regrets about the loving. Only grief that there wasn't more time. 3 weeks later, Garrett stood at the forge working metal that glowed white hot. He was folding Thyra's ashes into steel, the way orc warriors did for their honored dead. The blade took him 5 days to complete, 5 days of barely sleeping, barely eating, just working, pouring everything he couldn't say into metal and fire and the ancient rhythm she'd taught him. When it was finished, it was the finest thing he had ever made, fierce and beautiful and strong, just like her. He hung it above the workspace, right next to Elena's portrait. Two women who'd taught him in different ways that being alive meant choosing to feel things even when feeling hurt. The painted face and the forged blade, both watching over him, both smiling in their own ways. Two women, he said to the empty forge. Two women taught me to live. His voice echoed in the space, but the echo didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded full, rich, with memory and loss and love and the choice to keep going anyway. The door opened. Garrett looked up expecting a customer, found instead a young orc, maybe 16, nervous and hopeful in equal measure, holding a dagger with an embarrassed grip. "I heard you take apprentice," the boy said. His voice cracked on the last word. He stood like he was ready to fight for what he wanted, like someone had taught him that the things worth having were worth fighting for. Garrett looked at him, saw Thyra in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stood, saw all the young people who'd come after she was gone, all the ones who'd need teaching, all the ways he could keep living, keep choosing, keep honoring both women who had saved him from himself. "What's your name?" "Kale Ironfoot." "I'm Garrett." He smiled, the first smile since day 60. It felt rusty, uncertain but real. "Yeah, I do take apprentices. Let's see that dagger." Kale stepped forward, hopeful, eager, young. Garrett took the blade, examined it professionally, turned it over in his hands. The metal was good, the tempering needed work, the balance was off. "First thing you need to know," he said. "Metal has a language. You have to learn to listen." "I want to learn." "Good, because I have a lot to teach." The forge roared back to life. Garrett showed Kyle where to stand, how to hold the hammer, where to strike. The boy was clumsy at first. Too much force, not enough control. But he learned quick. They worked through the morning, through the afternoon, and Garrett found himself talking, teaching, explaining the things Thyra had taught him, the things Elena had taught him, passing forward the knowledge that had been given to him by two women who'd refused to let him stay buried. As the sun set, Kyle looked up at the wall, at the portrait and the blade hanging side by side. "Who are they?" Garrett followed his gaze. Elena's smile, Thyra's fierce beauty captured in steel. "Teachers," he said, "both of them. They taught me that grief and love aren't opposites. They're companions. You carry both, you choose both, and you keep living anyway." They must have been important. They were. They are. He turned back to the anvil, to the work, to the young orc boy who reminded him that life continued, that legacy mattered, that the best way to honor the dead was to keep teaching the living. 3 strikes. Pause. 2 strikes. The rhythm echoed through the forge. Their rhythm. His and Elena's and Thyra's and now KL's. The sound of metal being shaped, of rough edges being smoothed, of something broken being made whole again. Above them, the portrait and the blade watched, both smiling in their own ways. And if Garrett looked at them just right in the firelight, at just the right angle, he could almost hear their voices. Elena's "Don't stop living." Thyra's "Being seen is worth dying for." Both of them "Keep going, keep choosing, keep living." So he did, day after day, week after week. The forge burned bright. Kale learned fast. More students came. Word spread that the blacksmith in Ironwood Creek was taking apprentices again, teaching again, living again. Garrett worked and taught and remembered. He talked to the portrait, to the blade, to the memories that lived in the spaces between hammer strikes. And slowly, over months and years, the forge stopped being a prison and became what it had always meant to be. A place where broken things were made whole, where raw material was shaped into something stronger, where loss and love lived side by side and both were honored, where a man who'd been dead for 5 years learned from a woman dying in months that the opposite of grief wasn't happiness. It was gratitude for the time you had, for the love you chose, for the courage to keep reaching even when you knew reaching meant eventually letting go. Garrett Ashford worked his forge until his hands shook with age, taught students until they became masters. Lived until living felt less like survival and more like choice. And every morning before lighting the fire, he touched the bracelet on his wrist, read the inscription he had memorized years ago. For the man who taught me being seen is worth dying for. Then he'd look at the portrait in the blade, at the two women who'd seen him when he couldn't see himself, who'd refused to let him stay buried, who'd taught him that being alive meant choosing to feel even when feeling hurt. Thank you, he'd say, for teaching me, for seeing me, for not giving up. Then he'd light the forge, call for his students, and get back to work. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes. The rhythm of remembering, the rhythm of living. The rhythm of a man who'd learned too late that the best way to honor the dead was to choose life. Every single day. The forge burned bright. The hammer sang. And Garrett Ashford, who'd been dead for 5 years and brought back by a dying warrior, kept his promises. To Elena, to Thyra, to himself, he lived.